Good morning, everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives. And this morning, we're welcoming once again our good friend Harley Schlanger to update us on what's going on in the world that he lives in over there in Germany, what's going on in American politics, which he studies like a hawk, and what he thinks we can do to survive and thrive in the Biden administration. Good morning, Harley.
Hi, John. How are you?
I'm great. I'm great. How you doing?
Pretty well, pretty well. It's a little cold here these last few days, and we haven't seen the sun in about 2 weeks, but maybe that's somehow related to the ascension of Joe Biden to the presidency.
It could very well be. Yeah, it could be Bill Gates and his friends at Harvard too. Who knows?
Yeah.
Well,
But
a lot going on in the news. Not much happy stuff to report, I'm afraid, from my point of view, trying to restore and protect the American Republic as it slips off the map. But maybe you've got something hopeful to share with us.
well, ultimately I do. But to start with, I mean, we have to look at what just happened. The coup was finally successful. The 4-year coup that was run to get rid of Donald Trump, to prevent the United States from returning to a nationalist orientation of a sovereign nation, of a constitutional republic. It was a coup against that, and a coup not just against Donald Trump, but as we see increasingly from the discussion that's taking place from Biden, Pelosi, and others, a coup against the American people. An attempt to demonize the 75 million people who voted for Donald Trump, calling them racists, Nazis, terrorists. We see a censorship regime, what Helga Zepp-LaRouche is calling the new fascism. So, as you're saying, yes, it doesn't look so good. And then you have things like Biden, one of the first things he did was put the United States back into the Paris Climate Accord, send troops across the Iraq border into Syria, uh, repeal a number of the executive orders, and then we have the impeachment papers that were filed today. And then to top it all off, you have today the convening by the Davos billionaires of the World Economic Forum to finalize the plans for the Great Reset, which I would argue is what the whole coup is about in the first place. The idea that after John F. Kennedy, the decision was made by the globalists to never allow an American president who's a nationalist, who breaks from the special relationship with London, never allow that again. And Trump cracked that ceiling. He broke through. And they were completely hysterical about it and spent 4 years trying to get rid of him. And now here's the point. Here's why I think there's a reason for optimism. They believe they've got it in the bag. They think they succeeded. They fail to think about what it means to have 75 million voters who voted for Trump, who are not just going to go away, who are not going to return to apathy and hiding under the couch. So we have a potential. There are also many countries that won't accept the Great Reset, that could potentially ally with the United States. So we have a potential, but in the short term, it looks like we're going to face some very tumultuous times, a lot of chaos, possible false flags, including new wars and also terrorism in the United States.
Oh, I didn't like that last comment. Terrorism in the United States. It's something we have endured on a kind of what must be a small scale, but with all these single shooter incidents that happened. And I can't help but notice that the single shooter incidents cut dramatically since during the Trump administration. But yeah, terrorist acts in the United States, and of course we do have the vocal Antifa types still acting up and apparently attempting to make their voice heard over that of President Biden, just to keep their momentum going. That's an interesting question of whether Biden will confront the Antifa activists Or will he concede cities like Portland and Seattle and others to them as they grow more and more powerful, more and more violent, and better armed?
Well, I don't think Biden has a whole lot to do with this. I think Biden is a figurehead, a fairly pathetic figurehead at that. I don't even think Kamala Harris is calling the shots. If you go back to the time of the Obama Biden administration, it wasn't really Obama that was making the policy. It was dictated to him by this globalist elite, the intersection of corporate cartels, Citibank, international finance, and so on. But to get to your point, let's take a look at this thing, because the question of terrorism is being bandied about in the press as right-wing nationalists, Klan type, Nazi type, who are going to try to get rid of the Biden administration and bring back Trump. Now, what happened on Inauguration Day when we were told there would be militias marching through the streets with arms and threatening the civil peace? It didn't happen. The only violence came from the left, from Antifa, from Black Lives Matter, cities like Portland, Seattle, other cities around the country. But here's the important point, and this is something that you know, and I think a lot of your listeners know. Don't get caught up in this left-right paradigm. A lot of these false flag terror attacks are conducted by people who could be in either camp, because the behind it is provocations, is organization of institutions like the FBI. If people think back, and I know maybe some people aren't old enough to remember this, but I think you and I are, the FBI in the 60s was at the same time carrying out COINTELPRO against the anti-war movement, where they were literally organizing leftist radicals to blow up buildings, to shoot at police. They were infiltrating the Black Panther Party, Black nationalist organizations, to create the sense of a terrorist movement. But at the same time, they were inside the Ku Klux Klan, the American Nazi Party. That is, the FBI had provocateurs in both left and right. And you may remember the buses that were blown up in Michigan during the anti-busing. Turns out the guy who was coordinating that was an FBI provocateur. So there's a long history of this. Then in Europe, as you know, John, because you've been reporting this, you have, through NATO, Operation Gladio, which deployed left and right-wing terrorists. So I don't really think that, even though many of the Trump supporters, in fact, most all of the Trump supporters are demoralized now by the outcome of the election and the question of whether or not the vote was accurate, whether it should have been challenged, it was challenged, the courts didn't hear it, there was no investigation. With all of that, I don't think the threat comes from the Trump supporters. It comes from those people running the intelligence community who want to destroy the nationalist movement. And by nationalist, I don't mean white nationalist, I mean American nationalist, the American system movement of Donald Trump that he supported. So that's why there's a danger of a false flag, to justify censorship, to justify increased surveillance, to justify preemptive actions, and also to justify the FBI going into these agencies, finding unstable people and preparing them to launch attacks. So I think this is what we're looking at now after the January 6th event, which never has been investigated either. I mean, Donald Trump was impeached 1 week after that without any evidence to show that he fomented the riot that took place at the Capitol. In fact, people were storming the Capitol while he was still speaking. So, you know, that's why I say watch out for the line on terrorism. We know who the terrorists are. They're the intelligence agencies, and they've been doing this all over the world for years, and now they're doing it in the United States.
Yes, and this is part of the lessons that I've learned from my study, and this is what I think the American people have got to face. It, you know, in so many instances, you find intelligence agencies, and primarily, sadly, our own CIA, on whom we depend for the security of our nation, are actually employing and using and utilizing very, very dark methods. People who are hired assassins, the sale of narcotics, the importation of narcotics into this country, the exploitation of children, of youth, these things which we would like to think the CIA is protecting us from. Over and over again, we find intelligence agencies involved. And at a certain point, the American people are going to realize that President Kennedy was right. It is long past time to take the CIA and splinter it into 1,000 pieces and cast it to the wind.
Well, John, this is part of the positive side of what's happened in the last 4 years. In order to thwart the efforts of Donald Trump to break out of the paradigm of the Bush, Clinton, Obama era, which was based on the idea of a unipolar world with the United States and the City of London with NATO imposing its will in order to collect the debts for the international banks. That was what was being done. And that's why we had all these regime change wars. They were attacking countries that didn't want to go along with the International Monetary Fund, didn't want to go along with the City of London. And that was the paradigm that Hillary Clinton was going to carry through had she been elected. Trump never supported that. He was opposed to those wars. And they did everything they could to sabotage his potential, to pull us out of the wars, to change the intelligence community. And now we're seeing some of the documents finally getting out. For example, what came out at the end of last week, the Christopher Steele report, that the FBI knew that everything he said was a lie. They knew he was working for Hillary Clinton. They knew that his so-called special informant was actually working for Fiona Hill, not the Kremlin, the Fiona Hill of Ukraine impeachment fame. So the good news is that because the president fought, and because of the kind of work you're doing, handfuls of other websites, what we're doing at the LaRouche organization, there are many more people today who understand that we're under attack. And we're not under attack by the Chinese or the Russians or other foreign sources, except the Five Eyes. That's who's been the enemy of the United States for our whole history. So that's the good news. People have figured out some of this, and more people know about it now than ever before. The question then is, how do you take that potential movement, which never fully coalesced around a real strategy? And here's what I mean by that. There were too many people who jumped in and tried to divert attention by saying it's the Chinese, the Chinese rigged the election. The Chinese launched the COVID flu to deliberately attack the United States, and on and on and on. It's a classic example of a diversion tactic, just like a false flag, because the evidence was there of the role of MI6, of GCHQ, of their networks in the Italian Secret Service who were working with Joseph Mifsud, the Australian Alexander Downer, who planted the story initially of the Russian hacking the Democratic Party, the Stefan Halper, who's a shared asset of Britain and the United States. All of these things are there, and much, much more. And then you see the channels of corruption through Brennan, through Clapper. And if you trace this back, what you see is the old Dulles crowd from the CIA in the 50s and 60s, the Wall Street bankers, the law firms, that were the people that Kennedy realized, I think a little too late, were the enemies of the country. So people are learning that, but we've got to make sure and one of the things that I learned from Lyndon LaRouche many years ago is, if you want to conduct a counterintelligence operation, know your enemy. Don't get diverted. Understand they have two ways of operating. They use various kinds of operations, but they also manipulate. They play both sides. And that's why this left right paradigm has to go. We've got to define, and I think Trump was starting to do this, but never fully did it, define a national mission for all Americans. That's what he was trying to do. And he was disrupted from doing that by Russiagate and everything else. But that still remains the basis of getting rid of this so-called deep state, the criminal cabal that ran the Russiagate operation that's been involved since the Kennedy assassination and earlier in trying to destroy the United States as a sovereign republic. So know the enemy and then come up with a counter strategy.
Well, that's a great place to start. And I love the idea of focusing where, where the work has already been done by your organization. By this morning, Harley, I was reviewing and reading for the first time some of the great EIR articles written by Webster Tarpley back in the 90s when he was just tearing it up, explaining the connection from Venice to London to Palmerston, and then from Palmerston, all of the craziness that he was involved in. It just ties everything together beautifully. And so this is one of the things that I find to be the best resource for me right now, is to go back to the old EIRs, which are on LaRouchePub.com. And I was just thrilled this morning to finally understand the Shakespeare play Othello, which I've always struggled with, because I didn't realize why. That there was the other one that I always struggled with was Hamlet, and I finally realized why, and that's because I'm Hamlet. And and the thing about Othello is that this morning, with the help of Tarpley's great analysis, I realized that my father was in fact Othello, and not in the strict sense of the unfortunate murder of his wife at the end, but at the same time, the man who was kind of a unsophisticated in terms of politics and intrigue. Yeah. But the great warrior who saved Venice, and this is the thanks that he gets. So that kind of depth, that kind of analysis that your organization, LaRouche and Schiller and everyone, and I don't wish to try to comprehensively say, but everything that you guys have done, it's still online. It's so educational. I can't fail to mention the pleasure I get out of reading EIR, Harley.
Well, there are two things I'd say on that. I mean, the first is that one of the points Lyndon LaRouche always made is that this is a cultural fight, that the enemy understands the vulnerabilities of various national ideologies, and they manipulate people around their prejudices, around their views, and what they think about, how they feel. This is how identity politics works. But this is what Shakespeare, this is his true genius. Shakespeare understood that the tragedy was not necessarily the failure of the great man. Although you look at Hamlet, you look at Macbeth, you look at Othello, and you see a figure who is brought down. And was he brought down by his tragic flaws? Well, what Shakespeare shows you is that it's the culture that was corrupt. The tragedy is that the culture as a whole was corrupt. And so in Othello, what you see is that the character of Iago represents the typical person striving to power, who may not have all the skills, but can manipulate, can lie, can cheat, and bring other people in on that because other people are jealous of Othello. The same thing with Hamlet. The key line in that is there's something rotten in Denmark. It wasn't just Hamlet. It was the society. So you look at the way Shakespeare did essentially a project on ideology. What are the vulnerabilities and weaknesses of a population that makes them fall for these kinds of operations? Now, it happens that after Shakespeare, and Shakespeare was involved in a war at the time, you had Dudley, you had Dee, who was the head of the Secret Service for Queen Elizabeth. You had Marlowe, who was a part of this, who was murdered in a barroom brawl, typical kind of operation. What were they fighting over? They were fighting against what they saw coming up over the horizon, what became the Anglo-Dutch Empire. They saw the Royal Dutch movement coming in and seizing the monarchy after 1688, after Shakespeare's death. But what was that Anglo-Dutch monarchy? It was modeled on the Venetian Empire, which was, the Venetians were very tricky because they lived in a somewhat indefensible area. It's hard to run an empire from that part of Italy. But nevertheless, they were able to do it by guile, by manipulation and fraud, and to a certain extent, power. But then they moved to Amsterdam and then to London. And now they thought they had the ability to do this globally. And this was a fight that went on in England, which ultimately was won by the Anglo-Dutch monarchs. And so at that point, we saw the emergence of people in what became the American colonies who were trying to escape from that, who wanted to get out from under this oligarchical manipulation. And that's what our revolution was about. It was against an oligarchy that used the weaknesses of population to keep them enslaved. And in terms of the United States, what did the British use? You mentioned Palmerston. He's a key figure, the foreign minister for many, many years during Queen Victoria's reign. What he used were three groups in the United States to try and break the United States apart. The Southern planters, who essentially believed in an agrarian society, cheap labor, slave labor. And what was the product of slave labor? It was cotton that was sold cheaply to the British textile mills. But they also had the New York bankers that were very much a part of this, and the Boston merchants, who were the original drug traders, the clipper ships, the opium traders who were working with the British through Hong Kong and elsewhere. So they had those three networks that were deployed to break the United States apart. And I think it was the genius of Lincoln to come up with an actual national mission, not just the war, the Civil War. Lincoln's genius was to revive the American system, which he was doing in the 40s and the 50s, the 1850s. The idea of a national economy using a national rail system as a means of industrializing the country with federal credit, with national credit, as opposed to giving private speculators control of the economy. And that knitted the country together. It led to an industrial boom and made the United States the envy of the world. And we saw in the 1870s and 80s, many other countries copying the American system model. Now, just quickly, one other thing on what we call the British Ideology Project. At Oxford University, there's something called the Ashmolean Museum, which is where the original British Freemasonry was launched. They conducted national projects, the studying of national ideologies. How did people think in different societies? How was religion a factor, race a factor, ethnicity, family, and so on? This was the British operation. This is where the whole Lawrence of Arabia, Sykes-Picot manipulation of the Middle East came from. In the 1850s, it was from this center, the Ashmolean Museum, that they built the Wahhabites, which became the Saud family, into becoming the dynasty on the Arabian Peninsula. They studied the American ideology. And from the British standpoint, the Americans are paranoid because if something doesn't go right, they assume that someone's doing something against them. So they say Americans are inclined toward paranoid conspiracy theories. Now, why do they say that? Because Americans know that the British are conducting operations against us and had been in the whole 19th century and then continued in the 20th century. I would argue the Kennedy assassination was ordered from London. The whole series of wars that we've seen with the Project for a New American Century, the neoconservatives, that comes from British intelligence and including NATO. And the bad economic policies, neoliberalism, Well, they blame the Austrians for that, the Austrian school. It's really the British. And in fact, it was Thatcher who imposed the neoliberal model, which is destroying the world economy today. So I know that's a longer story there, but I think if you actually understand what we're dealing with, we have to use the best of our cultural heritage to figure out what was great about America, what is good about America, and how have we been manipulated over the course of 2.5 centuries to do things that were against the national interest. And I think the 2016 was a potential turning point that scared the hell out of these global oligarchs. The idea of the American people coming back into the tradition of Alexander Hamilton, of George Washington, of Lincoln, of FDR with the positive policies he had at the time of the Depression, and then leadership in World War II, and opposition to the British Empire, which was then key for both Eisenhower and Kennedy. That scared the hell out of them. And it's led to a project going back to the mid 60s of shifting the United States into a post industrial society of muddle headed people who don't believe in science and actually think that human beings are destroying the planet. So we have vulnerabilities that we have to figure out, and that's part of how you win this fight.
Awesome. That was quite a great summary, and I'm going to have to go back and listen to that again. It ties an awful lot of things together for people that maybe have never seen the connections to the British and the City of London, the great financial power of the world, and how it reaches out to distort and change and destroy, as it will, for its own benefit around the world, and particularly right now here in the United States, where we're feeling the pressure against our republic very, very strongly. Hey, I want to take a. Oh, go ahead, Harley.
Just say one addendum to that. What's the most dangerous thing going on in the world right now besides Joe Biden being president? It's that Biden is orienting toward another British operation called the Great Reset, which Klaus Schwab is the figurehead for this. Who is he relying on to pull together the network to do this? Prince Charles. There have been a series of events that Prince Charles has presided over, with Schwab there, with people like Bill Gates, with Larry Fink from BlackRock, with Mark Carney, the former head of the Bank of England. Janet Yellen is a part of this. And what the Great Reset is about is the idea that, well, since we can't go back to normal, where we were before the COVID crisis, and I would argue they're right about that, we can't go back to what we've done since 2008. We do need a break from that. But what they're saying is, in order to protect the swindlers who ran the crash of 2008 and then ran up debts and bubbles since 2008, that what they're saying is that we need a shift away from production, the productive sector, and instead go into a post-industrial global green economy in which the central banks dictate the policy. That's what the Great Reset is. It's giving the central banks and the technocrats working for them control over spending policy, not just credit and monetary policy, but spending. So why have governments? Why have elections? That's what they're moving towards. And that's what's taking place starting today, presided over by Prince Charles, Schwab, Gates, and a handful of others. And this is what's the most dangerous thing. And when we come back on this, I can tell you why it won't work.
Well, I'm glad to hear that it won't work, but I hope it doesn't cause a global crash while it's trying to work. And that's certainly possible as they gain control of spending. Then they gain control of food. They gain control of a person's ability to earn a living. They gain control of everybody's lives. And that, of course, has been the goal of Palmerston himself, to control not just Britain, not just the colonies, but the entire world. it's a consistent dream of certain crazy people behind the throne of Great Britain that has still, it's like Cecil Rhodes's will and his trust. He's dead, but his hand is still very active in the world. There used to be a legal doctrine called mort main, which said that you can't own something. A dead hand can't own something. You can't just take your capital, your assets, and just own it in perpetuity without doing something with it. But that's what I think has been the game, is that you just pull all the capital off of the table, and then when you run out again, then you cause a war, or you cause a civil war, and you can base it on religion, or as I think is kind of going on right now, you can base it on race. And but this idea of white privilege is something that fascinates me, because it's a perfect propaganda tool to reverse what really should happen, and that is that instead of lowering the standard of living of people who have traditionally been favored, to raise the standard of living of people who have traditionally been unfavored. But that doesn't seem to be in the cards. That instead they'd rather blame everything on, the people who have traditionally controlled the society, and then let the elites, just keep their money off the table as they always have. That way of dividing and conquering is coming. I mean, it's coming through people like a AOC, the representative from New York, and other people that are just ready to play the Robespierres of this time, the Dantons, the ones that are going to take the idea of raising the living of the people and turning it into a violent revolution that will create chaos and then allow the elites to come in and own the remainder. It's happened so many times in history, Harley, and that's one of the things that I learned from reading you and your colleagues at LaRouche.
Well, and one of the things that is important is that they don't care if people die. In fact, if you study the works of Prince Charles and his father, Prince Philip, over the last 40 years, they've been committed to the idea of reducing the world's population. And for this, they look to that great Satanist, Lord Bertrand Russell, who argued that war so far has been ineffective at limiting population growth. And he said, what we need is a great plague every generation or so the survivors may procreate freely. Now, if you look at this book, The Impact of Science on Society by Bertrand Russell, what he argues is essentially that what we know as the American system, an optimism about the potential for scientific and technological development of society, that the way you deal with poverty is not by killing off the poor, but by providing opportunities, by developing their skills and through education, providing opportunities for them to work in new industries where they may have a skill set from an old industry, but they have the capability of assimilating new technologies. That's how the American system has worked. There were 3 reports written by Alexander Hamilton when he was Treasury Secretary in 1790 and 1791. The last one was called the Report on Manufactures. And what he said is that the way you increase the wealth of a country is through development, I'm using now the modern language, but development of new technologies, the increasing of the power of labor to create new value. And Hamilton's work was the basis of the American economic system. Now, who's been slandered more than Alexander Hamilton? He's called a monarchist. This comes from a classic example of lazy historians, besides the slander. They say that, well, at the Constitutional Convention, Hamilton gave a 6-hour argument for a monarchy. He did it the way Plato had Socrates build up something only to tear it apart. Hamilton was no monarchist. He was one of the leaders of the forces, or he was the aide-de-camp to General Washington during the Revolutionary War. He was a profoundly committed Republican. And who killed him? Aaron Burr, who was working for the British banks. After Burr killed him in the duel they had, the so-called duel, Burr went to London and was safe housed by Jeremy Bentham.
Oh, I didn't know that. Bentham, huh?
And Bentham was a fraudulent character who developed this idea of the utilitarian calculus that what is good is what makes the most people happy. Well, that could be an opium den or a whorehouse. No value, the higher value except immediate pleasure. Bentham was working with the British East India Company. They were the ones who deployed the murder of Hamilton. And since that time, they murder him over and over and over by slandering him. Now, one of the things that's interesting, when Trump first came in, he had several events where he spoke about reviving the American system. And who did he talk about? He talked about Henry Clay. He talked about Lincoln. Well, this was the Whig tradition that then became the Republican Party in 1856. What was their model? It was the founding fathers and Hamiltonian economics. So people who say Hamilton was for the Bank of England, no, he wanted a national bank that would be under the control of elected officials, that would attract certain amounts of private money, but would limit the power of private investors to control policy. The Constitution gives that to the Congress. And what we've seen now with the Federal Reserve on steroids is that the central bank is acting as essentially an instrument for the largest private banks and hedge funds to swindle the American people. That's not a Hamiltonian policy. The idea was that you have to have a policy which invests in future technologies, whether it's infrastructure, new manufacturing. That's in his report on manufacturers, the third report that he issued. So this is a fight, John. This is the fight we have to have now with the American people. That a radical free market neoliberal policy is not the American system. The American system is committed to total freedom, but freedom within the idea of serving the general welfare, which is in the preamble to the Constitution. And these are the kind of debates we have to start having now.
Yeah, I'm looking for my debate partner because I'm completely ready to take up my side of it. I don't understand why nobody on their side even wants to talk to me, but I guess they're in their echo chamber. We used to laugh about Rush Limbaugh and the Ditto Heads back in the day, and I swear we've run into the same problem on the left now. That they don't want to break out of their echo chamber. They really hard to get their attention, which brings back a couple of points I wanted to try to get to today.
Okay.
Let's start though with a question from Housatonic Live, who posted a question a few minutes ago. I want to try to get to, and that is about Echo Health Alliance and Peter Daszak and the connection to British money in, there it is, British Intel role is huge. Eco Health Alliance, the third-party group that Fauci used to fund the Wuhan lab, was run by a British man named Peter Daszak. I've been following a little bit on this Peter Daszak story. I wonder if that's hit the radar screen over where you are, Harley.
Well, I know we're looking into that a little bit. I'm not, since I'm not in the U.S., I'm not
Okay.
up to date on it. But I'll tell you the one thing that you have to look at is that biological and chemical warfare was a specialty of the British. And if you go back to the more recent period, like the Skripal, the attempted assassination of Skripal, why is Porton Downs, which is one of the few places that's producing biological and chemical weapons, the place they go to get confirmation of these things? This is the kind of thing that there's so many questions that are raised by this. The question of Wuhan is really very difficult to unravel, but there are also those people who say that this was launched from Fort Detrick, the pandemic. So, I'm not a virologist. I don't read the various reports, but I think that you have to realize that these things do happen. that there are breakouts of biological effects, but you have to look at two sides of it. One is, why do these things spread? And that has to do with the destruction of the public health system in the Western world because of austerity and privatization, because of neoliberalism. So, and this is what President Trump was initially saying when he said the problem was because of what Obama and Bush did to the healthcare system. We weren't prepared for this kind of crisis. Now, the second point then is, how is something like this used for an agenda? And I think this is where you have to go back before the COVID, the discovery of the so-called coronavirus. What was happening with the economy last in the summer of 2019 and the fall of 2019? It was heading toward a collapse. The repo markets, the $100-something billion a day in short-term loans to zombie corporations to keep things from blowing out. Then the COVID crisis became the convenient excuse to blame the economic crisis on. But it was the fact that we never fixed what was done in the early 2000s under Bush and Cheney, and then was escalated as a looting policy under Obama. So I think you have to look at these privatized companies, including Big Pharma, the so-called big health industry, which certainly deserves some blame for what's happened. But I think we need this is where you have to have cooperation of all nations. The best scientists in every country sit down and figure out what actually happened before fingers are pointed.
Okay, and thanks for taking that question from Mark Housatonic, one of the great researchers that I've been connected to for a couple of years now. And his research is posted at Housatonic Live. Thanks again to Norman Smith. He's a very kind contributor. He says the American people are awake. We're ready, and he's always a positive spirit. So thank you, Norman. And I think we're waking up, but only half of us are waking up so far. Let me ask another angle to the same question: is how do you deal with the founding fathers when in an atmosphere where everybody, the only thing they want to think about is how those people were slaveholders, they were elitists themselves, they were, the tendency to consider them to be a whole bunch of white, egotistical racists is prevalent, and that's the message that I think a lot of people are getting, not only from the press and from politicians, but unfortunately from their educations now. How can we confront that with trying to get people to look at people as individuals again? Because this idea of class warfare is really looming to me. I think class warfare is part of where the Democratic administration is going to take us, unfortunately. So how can we avoid it?
Well, there's something called historic truth. You're not going to get it from things like the New York Times 1619 Project, which was a bunch of garbage. You're not going to get it. I mean, there was just an article the other day about how Beethoven was the biggest racist. Music was written to appeal to white ears. What are white ears? You have an absolute absurd series of formulations which are typical of a period of breakdown, where you introduce excuses for people not doing work. Now, you want to know something about the founding fathers? How many people have actually read Hamilton's reports? How many people have read what Benjamin Franklin was doing? How many people have read the debates that went on about slavery? There was a real fight at the Constitutional Convention about slavery. And what ultimately happened, largely because of the British support for the slaveocracy, was that it became clear to Hamilton and others that if you abolish slavery, you wouldn't have a unified nation, and all the sacrifice of the Revolutionary War would be brought to nothing. And so that's why they tried to phase it out. Hamilton was very much opposed to slavery, as were people like John Lawrence, who was one of his best collaborators from South Carolina, Franklin. Washington freed the slaves. his slaves. There was a huge fight over this, though, because it was clear that if you have a nation that's committed to freedom, you can't oppress any section of the population. You need a national mission. And what Hamilton and Franklin and others decided is the way to address this is to have a booming economy which needs more people to be employed, more people educated, and doesn't work on slave labor, but actually works on giving people the opportunity to have full freedom. So first thing you do is you actually study the documents at the time, the arguments, the fighting that went on, the debates. And what you find is that there was a huge push coming from the City of London and from its allies in the United States to accept for the interim a slave system. But Hamilton and others said this is not going to produce wealth. It doesn't produce wealth. It produces wealth for a very small group of people, namely the people who run the textile mills. So, my other point is that this race theory of history is crap. Look, were there racists? Absolutely. Why is it that no one talks about people like King Leopold of Belgium or British royal family? You want to talk about racists? Prince Philip once said we can't eliminate all Africans because we need people to take us on safaris. These are the real racists.
Yes.
These are people who funded the Nazi eugenic projects, which, by the way, were more advanced in the United States in the 1920s than they were in Germany, funded by the Harrimans and the Rockefellers and people like that, the Bush family.
And the Carnegie.
Racists.
Yeah.
And yet they're the ones today who are pointing the fingers. So, honest historical research, which is what we try to do all the time. And I'll tell you, there's a famous saying, the truth never dies, but it lives a horrible life. We have to revive truth seeking. And that's, again, why classical culture is so useful, because you actually have to think about how do people form opinions? How can people be manipulated the way they are? And, you look at something like the Q phenomenon, and you realize that people who were angry legitimately about Hillary Clinton and about Russiagate were slowly, by what was essentially a very sophisticated video game, brought into a belief that the military is going to intervene at the last minute and keep Donald Trump in the White House. And so you had a lot of people who didn't do everything they could have done to mobilize for the election because they were told, trust the plan. You don't have to do anything. Trust the plan. Just learn for yourself what the problems are. Well, this was a psychological operation run against the Trump supporters. So, I think this is where you have to really take a look at how this is done. And the other thing to look at here is when you have a monolithic view of the Black community, you're missing something, because not every African American supports Black Lives Matters or reparations, or believes that racism is the only problem. And yet that's the real racism, is to essentially say that the only solution for Black America is reparations and special appointments based on numbers or color, gender, and so on. So, we're in a real fight on this, John. This is going to be the big fight of the next year or so, in particular, because Biden, whether he wants to be or not, is a captive of this, and this is the game he's always played. You want to talk about racists? What about Kamala Harris, who argued not to give people early release in the California prison system, a large number of whom were African Americans who were caught on minor drug offenses, because we need them for the cheap labor for fighting forest fires. That's the vice president of the United States now who put that forward.
A sign of the times and incredible things that we just watch, and I'm kind of going to wait and see a little bit. I'm not trying to engage anybody right now. I think they're all still in their happy time of, yay, we won, we got rid of Orange Man. And we're still waiting to be sure, because they're still not quite sure that Orange Man's gone. So they keep their powder dry around the Capitol, all however many, from anywhere 25 to 65,000 National Guard and actual troops. And this is just so horrifying to me to see that it's going to extend out into March. Now they're saying they're going to keep the Capitol occupied to March. I'd be surprised if it doesn't last years. I think that's a big sign that what we have witnessed is not an election but a coup d'état, and that's the way I look at it.
That's very much like the United States becoming a banana republic. If you look at the inauguration, with all the troops, with no one in the audience, with no real sign of enthusiasm about the incoming administration, and then think about what happened just 2 weeks earlier in the Congress and then with the impeachment. This looked like a typical coup d'etat in a South American country. In fact, it may be insulting to South American countries to say that that's what it looked like. Now, what does that tell you about how far we've gone down the path to submitting to this new fascism? What does it mean when you have private monopolies like Google and Facebook and Twitter that can censor the president of the United States, that can say that if you question whether there were irregularities in the voting, you might be contributing to terrorism and therefore you'll be shut down? What does that say? Who gave the power to the monopolies? Well, it actually was, I think it was it Bill Clinton's Communications Act that gave them that special niche? But whatever, we've got to use the anti-monopoly legislation to break that power. So it does look a lot like a banana republic for the moment, doesn't it?
For the next 4 years, I'm afraid, and they'll just import as many voters as they need now. They open the southern border and say, hey, we almost lost Arizona this time. Let's bring in a 500,000 more Democratic voters, and pay them $50 a piece to go to the voting precinct. It's really depressing to think that this is real. They are going to be able to maintain power as long as there's Dominion voting machines. As long as states are stupid enough to entrust their vote to a easily manipulated voting machine. And that gets back to the race question, I'm afraid, because it looks to me that they're compensating for people's race by shifting a little tiny percentage, so that my vote's not worth as much as your vote is. That kind of shifting of vote by diminished weight, depending upon where you live or what other demographics they have about you, has been shown to exist by a number of people, that including Dr. Shiva of Massachusetts, whose work I do respect and commend people to check out. What's going on with? Go ahead.
One thing quickly on the voting question. I know right now, because of the demoralization, people are saying, well, they control this, we'll never get it back, and they're going to be permanently a majority. Look, the one thing, there's national and international politics, and there are things we can do internationally, because I was going to say that on the Great Reset, the reason it won't succeed is that most countries won't accept Prince Charles telling them how to run their economy. The Russians aren't going to accept it. That's why they're using this Navalny thing for regime change in Russia. The Chinese won't accept it. That's why they're trying to do a regime change in China. But those countries are not going to be toppled. And in Germany now, we're seeing a rebellion against the Green New Deal, which is the last place you'd expect it. The new head of the Christian Democratic Union, Armin Laschet, is someone who's considered a man of coal and steel, who's against the Green New Deal. And this is the ruling party. This is Merkel's party. Merkel, of course, sold out completely to the anti-coal, anti-nuke, anti-energy groupings. But there's going to be a backlash against this. So we have a strategic international picture to look at, a national picture. But here's the other thing. People who are now demoralized and depressed think about engaging in your local community, and whether you are involved in city councils, board of elections, state legislatures. We need the movement of the 75 million voters to participate in making sure that we get to the point where we can have fair elections. Now, it's going to be very difficult for Joe Biden and Brennan and these guys in Washington to stop a growing mass movement around the country from demanding fair elections, including maybe such things as paper ballots. So, I think this is something we have to talk about and strategize about. Then secondly, everyone's saying, oh, the 2022 election is going to go to the Democrats. Well, there are a number of so-called progressive Democrats. I don't know if you're familiar with people like Jimmy Dore, but they're saying that what Biden has done so far is going to sink the Democrats in 2022 if the opposition actually has a policy. And what Biden is going to do is going to make conditions worse for almost everyone except the billionaires in the United States. Now, the question then is, can we primary those Republicans who have turned on Donald Trump and get some real sovereign nationalists elected as the Republican candidates for 2022? So I think, look, it may take a few weeks, maybe a month or so for people to get over their despair and their distrust. But I think there's a possibility to organize locally to build up a mobilization that can overturn this. And we have allies around the world. So that's why I say it's not a moment of despair, but a moment of reality. But the reality is we have to become citizens again, every single one of us.
Amen to that. Every single one of us have to become citizens again, and not to just kick back and think, oh, we got rid of Orange Man, so everything's going to be fine now. It's not citizenship to just kick back and say, oh, my guys won like a football game and then wait for the next game. It's a far cry from what our Constitution requires of citizens. And I hope this is a wake-up call for everyone. Harley, I think you succeeded in giving me a spark of hope this morning and brightened up my day. I'm going to certainly be pursuing on my own level as much engagement as I can. And I think that's the best advice for everyone this morning as we recover from a rather disastrous January 2021. I look forward to seeing you in February, Harley, and I'll be grateful if we can even brighten our day some more with some more good news. But thank you.
We have to let our inner lights shine. I mean, the American people are basically good, but sometimes lazy. And, it's that goodness that has to be brought out. And again, that's partly the role of classical culture. And if people would like to be in touch with me, let me give out my personal email address, as I always do with you, John.
Please.
Have a lot of your viewers who have written to me, who are in touch with me. You can get a hold of me at harleysch@gmail.com. That's harleysch@gmail.com, and ask for links to our website and my daily update. I still am doing a 10 to 12 minute update every day. I haven't stopped just because Biden's the president. In fact, I may be more passionate and energetic than ever now. So you can get a link to my daily update and to my blog page by writing to me at harleysch@gmail.
Okay, that's it. And thanks, everybody. We'll be back tonight with some reading. I think I'm reading from The Population Control tonight by Jim Mars. Thanks, Harley, and we'll see you soon. Bye now.
See you.